Alô? Alô? Testando? Bom dia. Primeira coisa que eu queria dizer, as pessoas que quiserem certificado, falem com o Vitor ali atrás e deixem os seus dados, tá bom? Quem for da UFBA, deixa necessariamente o CPF. Quem não for, pode deixar o nome completo, basta o nome completo, né? E aí o sistema envia certificados automaticamente, tá bom? Essa é uma série de eventos que é promovida por 3 programas, o programa de pós-graduação em filosofia, em comunicação e em literatura e cultura. E a gente tem o enorme prazer de receber, entre hoje e 11 de dezembro, o professor Richard Eldridge, que é emeritus de Swarthmore College, que atualmente está na Universidade do Tennessee, nos Estados Unidos, para uma série de eventos que vão consistir em 2 mini-cursos sobre cinema e literatura, 2 palestras, e a gente vai fazer também debates sobre filmes no cinema da UFBA e no cinema do museu, né? O professor Richard Eldridge publicou extensamente em temas de estética e filosofia da arte, com uma ênfase mais recente em filosofia da literatura e do cinema, forte inspiração nas filosofias do Stanley Cavell, de Wittgenstein, no idealismo alemão e no romantismo. E entre os seus livros mais recentes estão Werner Herzog, Filmmaker and Philosopher, de 2019, e Images of History, Kant, Benjamin, Freedom and the Human Subject, de 2016. A coisa vai funcionar assim. Quem quiser fazer perguntas pode fazer a qualquer momento. O professor Eldridge prefere assim, então não vai haver um momento final ou intermediário para perguntas, tá? Então, a qualquer momento podem interromper, fazer perguntas. Vocês podem fazer perguntas tanto em português quanto em inglês, né, que o professor Lauro vai traduzir de qualquer uma das línguas para outra. Vocês podem fazê-las por escrito também. Se quiserem fazê-las por escrito, a qualquer momento é só escrever e passar para o Lauro, que ele também as traduz em voz alta, e a gente traduz depois a resposta consecutivamente, né? A gente vai fazer um intervalo às 10h30, entre 10h30 e 10h45, tá? E vai até meio-dia em princípio, tá bom? Richard, we're thrilled to have you here, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I have to begin with lots of thanks, especially to Raphael for inviting me here, to the government of Brazil and to the university for the funding for my visit, to all the technical people who are recording this, to the translators. Laura, I think, translated the notes that you have behind you. That is not my Portuguese. And to all of you for your interest in this topic. I'm sorry that I cannot myself speak in Portuguese, but I hope we will do okay. As Raphael, I gather, just said, questions are fine at any time, and they can all be in Portuguese, so Raphael will translate for me. I think it's best if we understand each other rather than that I simply rush through things as fast as possible. So good. Thank you for all of that, and thank you especially to Raphael. The topic of this class is why literature matters. I mean important literature, literature as a form of art, why it's important in human life. The overall arc of the class comes in 3 big parts. The first part is on Plato's criticisms of art and of literature in particular, and then Aristotle's response to those criticisms. That may be familiar material to you, I don't know, but it's worth going through, I think. We have things to learn from both Plato's criticisms and Aristotle's responses, even though I don't think either of them is quite fully correct. The second part of the course is on what happens to literature and to thought about literature in modernity, let's say roughly from 1600 or so onwards, where literature comes to be seen as primarily a source of pleasure, not a source of knowledge, so much at least. that clearly is a thought that's deeply embedded in our culture now. And I think there's some important truth to it. I do not think literature can play the role that either Aristotle or Plato thought it might play for us. In the third part, though, I try to recover a cognitive dimension for literature, seeing the cognitive aspect, or learning things from literature, and the affective aspect, are feeling pleasure in response to it and having other emotional responses as interrelated in important ways. That's returning to some ideas in Aristotle, but adapted to the modern world. So that's the overall plan. Plato plus Aristotle first, form, pleasure, and modernity second, and how to combine these two ways of thinking about literature, my own views, third. Good. So to start with Plato's criticisms of art, and now I'm with the notes here that are on the projection. According to Plato in Book 10, artists construct imitations of things, that is, descriptive or depictive renderings of how things look. These mememata, that's the Greek word for imitations, are products of poesis, or imitative making in general. They are not products of theoria, theory, or episteme, knowledge. And they are not pieces of praxis. They are not rearrangements of material objects for the sake of human welfare, such as cooking a dinner or actually making a bed. So these imitations, according to Plato, are at two removes from ultimate reality. They are copies of empirical objects, the looks of empirical objects, so partial renderings of empirical objects, the actual seeable, touchable beds, tables, persons, flowers, and things that are in the world. And those empirical objects are in turn copies or imitations of the ultimately real, eternally existing forms. How are we on sound? Sound is okay? Yes? Too fast, too slow, or? Good. Second, in producing these imitations, artists have no knowledge of the constructions or uses of the empirical objects whose appearances they render. So Socrates in Book 10 asks, an artist can paint a bit and bridle, while the smith and the leather worker can make them. Does the painter understand the proper form which bit and bridle ought to have? That's a leading question. The response should have been, well, no, but he understands how to make a good painting of them. That's making something in the world. But that's not something that the interlocutors say at this point. The implication is the artist just doesn't know how things in the world work, how they are to be made. And second, but what of the artist who does not use the empirical object that he makes, such as a flute or a bit and bridle? Has the artist either knowledge or correct belief about the construction and correct use of the object whose mere appearance he renders? No. So the implication is that artists don't know anything, and hence they are not to be trusted or learned from in what they do. In books 2 and 3, we see another line of criticism. These are all from the Republic. Instead of producing an object that is useful in life, such as a pot or a spear or a bed, artists produce, again, only imitations. And the use of the imitations is simply to move people to feel things, that is, to have emotions such as elation or grief at what is imitated, as well as to enjoy the imitations themselves. More specifically, as things now stand, the most important poetic imitations, the ones Socrates and Plato knew, for example, the poems of Homer and the plays of Aeschylus, Aristophanes, and Sophocles, those poetic imitations describe gods doing horrible things. For example, Zeus flinging his son Hephaestus from heaven, violating oaths, squabbling with one another, and becoming jealous, petty, and quick to anger and complain. These are, first of all, according to Plato, mistaken conceptions of what the gods are like. The divine nature, according to Plato, is unchanging, truthful, and good. He, of course, requires an argument for that, but that's the thought. Or, as he writes, a God is a being of entire simplicity and truthfulness in word and deed. In himself he does not change, nor does he delude others. So the gods in the stories of Sophocles and Homer are misrepresentations, lies about what the gods are really like. And second, those gods are very bad examples for children and adults to imitate. Merely engaging with these imitations, going to performances of plays and to recitations of the Homeric poems, makes one emotionally labile, that is, quick to feel too many emotions in a row, and fragile, as one is moved to grief, sorrow, elation, pity, and anger by things that are not really happening. This is bad for us. In general, we should be as much like the genuine gods as possible, namely unchanging, truthful, and good, in the way that Plato took the figure of Socrates to be. The only way to approach this, to be unchanging, truthful, and good, is to be concerned only with the truth, or, as Plato writes in the Republic, to be deceived about the truth of things, and so to be in ignorance and error, and to harbor untruth in the soul, is a thing no one would or should consent to. Falsehood in that quarter is abhorred above everything else, especially the form of falsehood in the Republic that Plato identified as pleonexia. That's a Greek word that means overreaching or grasping for material competitive advantage. Think of, in contemporary culture, thinking that the best thing to do in life is to become as rich as possible. Plato thought this was very bad. Socrates thought this was very bad. The contrast term is dikaiosune, being just, which turns out to mean caring about the things and pursuing the things that it's really worthwhile to pursue. Ultimately, for Plato, the good itself. And the way to do that is to do philosophy. And philosophers are typically not rich. There is an old joke that is ascribed to Diogenes, who was once asked why people give alms to the poor and the sick, but not to philosophers. And the answer is, well, they can imagine themselves being poor and sick, but they can't imagine being philosophers themselves. So a big contrast between the philosopher's conception of what's worth doing and caring about, truth, justice, the good, and doing philosophy, and grasping after competitive advantage in life, trying to become rich. In sum, as one commentator sums up Plato's thought, poets are, according to Plato, ignorant, beguiling, and deceitful. As a result of this, Plato has Socrates say in the Republic, most of the stories now in use must be discarded. We shall have to prohibit such poems and tales. So Plato is in favor of censorship of the arts by the rulers. There's one qualification. He does entertain the thought that there could be a kind of art and poetry that tells the truth about things, especially about how to live and about what we should value. In Book 10, Socrates says, nonetheless, be it declared that if the dramatic poetry, whose end is to give us pleasure, can show good reason why it should exist in a well-governed society, namely by showing that it presents the truth, we for our part should welcome it back, being conscious ourselves of its charms. Only it would be a sin to betray what we believe to be the truth. One might wonder whether Plato thought of his own dialogues, which are clearly dramatic constructions with characters, of his own dialogues as satisfying that condition, as a form of art that tells the truth. Does their way of teaching us fundamentally include the use of imitations? Does it move us, and do we take pleasure in them? Those are questions worth thinking about, I think. I'm, however, ultimately going to defend the very kind of literature that Plato and Socrates were concerned to condemn. Homer, Sophocles, modern lyric poetry, the novel, and all that is where I'm going. Okay, there are problems in Plato's views. We good for the first topic? So that's Plato's criticisms so far. Yes? Good. There are some problems in Plato's views. We might think that Plato's epistemology and metaphysics are not reliable. His argument in Book 5 of the Republic in favor of the existence of forms relies on the claims first that knowledge and opinion are essentially different powers or capacities. The reason for that is that genuine knowledge, according to Plato, is infallible, but opinion is fallible. And secondly, they essentially different powers have essentially different objects or things they target or aim at. Now, since the objects of opinion are empirical objects, this pen or this cup, the objects of knowledge must be different, because again, knowledge and opinion are different capacities, and different capacities must have different objects. So the objects of knowledge must be different, namely eternally existing immutable forms, things that can't change. But is that second premise, that essentially different powers have essentially different objects or things they aim at, is that correct? Can't some people genuinely know that, for example, labradoodles, the kind of dog, are generally very friendly, but other people merely believe it or disbelieve it? They're not sure one way or another. In both cases, the empirically existing actual dogs, labradoodles, seem to be the object or target of their propositional attitudes. So I'm not sure that I at all accept Plato's argument in Book 5 for the existence of forms. More important, while there is much to admire and learn from in Plato's defense of justice as dikaiosune, namely ordering one's soul to care about and pursue the things that are genuinely good and worth caring about, the importance of justice, dikaiosune, over pleonexia, one might think that his picture of how to do this is overly intellectualist and life and body denying. This was roughly Nietzsche's criticism of Plato. Plato's picture is that we must escape from the cave, from the world of ordinary sense experience and ordinary activities with other people. We must escape to the life of the intellect, manifested in doing philosophy. It is for this reason that the philosopher is the happiest of human beings. He is filled up or occupied with the most real things. And second, it's the reason that therefore it is better to be just than unjust, since the philosopher is perfectly happy because he is perfectly just, filled up or satisfied with the most eternally real things, as Book 9 of the Republic puts it. I think there's something to this argument. The intellectual life can be enormously satisfying and charming. So can mathematics, which I guess concerns eternal realities. But is that really true, that that way of life, the intellectual life, the philosophical life, the life of mathematics, is really better for people in general? Are philosophers, for that matter, famous for being just? Are philosophers typically happy? Are they more just and more happy than other people who are just doing their best without having philosophical knowledge? I'm not so sure about that. And aren't there lots of importantly enjoyable things that involve the use of the senses and interacting with others who are not philosophers? Family life, say, or sex, or excellent food, or a good winning streak by Esporte Club Bahia. That would be something to enjoy, I take it, and find meaning. Not very likely to happen?
Some people disagree, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's true, yes. All right, so I think there are things wrong with Plato's picture of ultimate reality, the forms, and of the perfectly good life, the life of the philosopher. Nonetheless, I think Plato's criticisms are important and are worth taking seriously, even if we reject Plato's metaphysics. Why is that? Why do Plato's criticisms matter? The answer to this I think, is that we still retain and are powerfully attracted by a view of what the truth is and of how to acquire it, which view does not make room for art and literature. I have in mind the practices of modern mathematical experimental physics, or of doing experiments that involve careful measurements and calculations in order to come up with laws that enable us both to predict and to explain things, and to gain some substantial control over nature. I'm not sure what things are like here now in Brazil with regard to university education, and secondary education as well, but in the United States, what is called STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, is absolutely overwhelming everything else. It's getting all the funding for the humanities, history, languages, being badly cut. And the reason is that STEM is thought to be the only thing that yields genuine knowledge and that produces things that are useful in life. That thought is a clear echo of Plato's criticisms. We see this echo of Platonism in Descartes, who, though disagreeing with Plato about the ultimate metaphysics, Descartes' metaphysics of nature are essentially atomist, and he rejects the idea of eternal Platonic forms. Descartes nonetheless retains the thought that the most important thing in life is knowledge, the thing that's most satisfying, and second, the kind of knowledge that enables us to make useful things. As Descartes puts it, this kind of knowledge is extraordinarily satisfying in itself. That's a kind of Platonic thought, scientific knowledge. And it is very useful in life, because scientific knowledge, as he says in the discourse, enables us to become masters and possessors of nature, to make lots of useful things. Compared with this, according to Descartes, reading a bunch of books, many of them fictions, just made-up stories, and mostly for the sake of an inferior pleasure, is both unsatisfying and a waste of time, Descartes argues. Here's what he says in the preface to a dialogue called The Search After Truth. A good man has no need to have read every book, nor to have carefully learned all that which is taught in the schools. The schools is a reference to Aristotelian university education at the time. You can hear in this term, the schools, a kind of sneer at bookish intellectualism. It would even be a defect in his education were he to have devoted too much of his time to the study of letters, that is, mere letters, things that are written, not the way the world is. There are many other things to do in life, and he has to direct that life in such a manner that the greater part of it shall remain to him for the performance of good actions, which his own reason ought to teach him, even supposing that he were to receive his lessons from it alone. It is, I think, in our world, very difficult not to be impressed by this line of Cartesian thinking. Never mind Descartes' initial skepticism in Meditation 1 and his strained way of responding to it by generating a purely intellectual argument for the existence of God and for God's endowing us with a reliable scientific method. We don't need all that to be impressed by Descartes' conclusions, by his general line of thinking. Pragmatically, as the contemporary philosopher Quine stresses, mathematical experimental physics and the technologies it yields just seems to work very well to solve a lot of important problems. Building bridges, discovering medical techniques and therapies, communication systems, computers. I could not be here in Bahia were there not jet airplanes that fly through the air. This line of thinking lies behind the enormous prestige accorded nowadays to STEM education and the comparative denigration of the humanities and arts. And I would add, I think it's correct that doing math and science can be very satisfying in itself for many people, very enjoyable. We might worry, I think, with Heidegger that the technological framing of the world by the modern world picture is also very bad for us in encouraging pleonexia and the rape of nature, especially in a time of climate change. Nonetheless, it is hard to see a straightforward way out of it, out of the modern technological world picture and its values. And it is equally hard to see how to defend the importance of humanities and the arts. So we're going to need a kind of argument about the importance of literature. How are we going to get that argument? One place to start is Aristotle and his reply to Plato. In contrast with Plato, whom he echoes in many important respects, especially ultimately in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, in the defense of the preeminent value of the theoretical philosophical life, Aristotle also offers a valuable defense of the arts in general and of dramatic poetry in particular. This defense begins with the claim that yes, the products of poesis or poetic making are mimemata or imitations, not otherwise useful things. They're renderings of the appearances of things. But Aristotle stresses here that these renderings are made from and for a point of view. This is obvious for renderings for perspective painting, where the image is constructed from a vantage point, directly opposite the vanishing point in the painting. A painting, a perspective painting at least, will typically be made in order to show how things look from that vantage point to painters who loved or otherwise cared about what they saw. Think of Cézanne obsessively painting Mont Sainte-Victoire, or Manet obsessively painting Rouen Cathedral. They were capturing the looks of things as objects of care or love. Viewers are in turn able, by way of the experience of the painting, to enter into the experience of what the painting presents, as well as to be aware of and to appreciate what the painter felt about what the painter was presenting. We see and feel, as it were, with the painter. Aristotle extends this thought to imitations of all kinds in all media. Interestingly, he regards music as the most imitative of the arts, perhaps because its appeal to feeling that is directed to and by a shareable, hearable acoustic arrangement is particularly strong and immediate. The point, the purpose of poetic imitations in general, then, is not simply getting right or classifying things in the world from a subject-independent point of view, just as they are in themselves, as it were. That is a guiding ambition of both Plato and Descartes. Instead, the point of poetic imitations, mimemata, is to present and afford an experience of how things matter to and for an experiencing subject. That's a line I'm going to push very hard, that literature presents to us how things matter. In the case of tragic drama, which is the main subject of the Poetics, the object of the presentation is a complete human action with a beginning, middle, and end. It is often hard to see beginnings, middles, and ends when we are caught up in the muddle of life, where lots of things are happening all the time, quite disconnected from one another. For example, there are people constructing something outside this room right now, which is not part of the unfolding action here. From out of this muddle, the poet selects the beginning, middle, and end, in order both to show how one thing leads to another, and how the patterns of beginning, middle, and end embody the kind of thing that in general is likely or liable to happen over time. It is this focus on universals or kinds of things that makes poetry more philosophical than history, according to Aristotle. Though I note that here Aristotle seems to have a conception of history as something like chronicle, or just a list of things that happen, rather than something that shows the kinds of things that are likely or liable to happen. That's not right. Against Aristotle, historians too thematize and tell stories and describe the kinds of things that happen. More specifically, Aristotle goes on, tragedies present a good, or at least a blameless man, suffering a downfall as a result of something he has done that manifests a hamartia, or flaw. I can say a lot more about hamartia, or what the tragic flaw is. I didn't put that in the notes, but I have things to say about that. Thank you. The downfall in question is a failure to achieve eudaimonia, happiness or well-being. Aristotle's general conception of eudaimonia is that it is activity in accordance with virtue, and among the virtues, the best or most important. The goal of all action, eudaimonia, he writes, is a certain activity, not a qualitative state. That, I think, is a very important thought. Very often we conceive of happiness in hedonic terms as a kind of continuing flow or sum of pleasant feelings. Aristotle instead emphasizes correctly, pleasant feelings are nice, nothing against them, but that what makes life okay for us is enjoying the things we do, enjoyment of engaging in worthwhile activity. Famously, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle presents two accounts of eudaimonia, that is, of what the worthwhile activities are that we can best enjoy. The first, in Book 3, centers around the idea of civic friendship, or participating with others who are friends, not enemies, in political practice, and broadly speaking, the political affairs of life, the management of households, families, and so forth. Aristotle also draws distinctions that are still important between different kinds of friendship. Friendships of pleasure, drinking buddies, people you hang out with. Friendships of business or convenience. Those are trading partners who reach an agreement with each other, though they may otherwise be in competition. And friendships of virtue, in which the friends share a single soul, as Aristotle puts it. So in each case, the people are not fighting, but they're not fighting for quite different reasons. Either they're just hanging out and having fun, or they're making a trade for their mutual advantage, or most importantly, they are managing a joint life together through conversation about what's worth doing together. Aristotle's general conception of soul here, psyche, is that it is a mode of organization of something that explains how an object or person so organized normally acts. So there are three kinds of soul, according to Aristotle. Nutritive or vegetative soul that explains why some bits of matter grow and develop, and others like this pen do not. Locomotive soul possessed by animals that can move themselves from place to place. In addition to growing and developing, plants have nutritive soul, but not locomotive soul. And finally, rational soul. Human beings have all three kinds of soul. We grow and develop. We move ourselves from place to place, so we're animals. But we also have rational soul. We characteristically, normally engage in conversation, deliberation, think about what to do, and choose. This conception of soul explains why plot, according to Aristotle, is the soul of tragedy. That is, it's the way of organizing the events into a beginning, middle, and end that explains why a tragedy does the work that it does, or has the effect that it does. What's that work that it does? Arousing pity and fear in order to achieve the catharsis of these emotions. More on catharsis in a few moments. In a friendship of virtue, for example, the friends organize their life together. They talk about and decide what to do together over time. They are committed to what they do with each other, making sense to and being meaningful to each other, each of them over time. in one of the movies I'm going to show. It happened one night. Is that this week or next week?
It is next week.
Next week. In that movie, I'm going to characterize the relationship between the principal figures in the movie, Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert, Peter Warren and Ellie Andrews, as an erotic friendship of virtue. That's pretty good. If you can be committed to another person, to what you do making sense to each other, and to managing a joint life together over time, and you get some sex besides, that's pretty good, it seems to me. So Aristotle's ideas about important kinds of friendships are still, I think, very important for us, about the importance of what he calls a friendship of virtue. So that's the Book 3 account of eudaimonia in the Nicomachean Ethics. In Book 10, in contrast, Aristotle, echoing Plato, characterizes the best life as the theoretical philosophical life. In leading that life, being philosophers, we become as like as possible to divine nous, or intelligence, or God. That's because God enjoys contemplating its own work in giving form or organization to matter, or hule, thus composing natural kinds. Divine intelligence gives form to things, makes them the kind of things they are. Again, an echo of Plato on the good as responsible for, the cause of the being and the knowability of all that is, as Plato says in the Republic. God gives form to matter, organizes it into really existing knowable things, and it enjoys that work and contemplating the goodness of that work, according to Aristotle. We can imitate or participate in that divine work ourselves by understanding things theoretically, by doing philosophy. In doing that, we live out with maximal effectiveness or aptness what it is to possess a rational soul. We use our rational soul, our way of being organized, and the capacities or powers it confers on it in the right way. We use it to do what it is to be used for. We live out with maximal effectiveness or aptness what it is to possess a rational soul. A classic puzzle, then, in Aristotle is how to reconcile the Book 3 picture of eudaimonia, friendships of virtue, with the Book 10 picture. I do not fully know the answer to this. One suggestion is that one thing that friends of virtue might do in thinking about their lives together is ethical theory. They might talk about the kinds of things that in general it is fully meaningful and satisfying for human beings to do, and to do together. In that way, talk and theory will then be bound up with and motivate what they do. In any case, it is the Book 3 picture, eudaimonia as civic friendship, that is primarily in view in the Poetics. Human beings are directed by their rational nature toward eudaimonia as a non-optional end, or telos. We are built, as it were, to act as rational souls. In particular, in this case, to form and inhabit friendships of virtue. Human beings act for the sake of eudaimonia. Their actions in general express complexes of habits, settled dispositions, and preferences, or what Aristotle calls character, hexis. Character is partly given in natural talents and preferences, but also significantly formed through training or habituation, with luck under the guidance of an older sophron, or man of practical wisdom. Without the right training, one is liable to be more or less an appetitive mess, another Platonic thought, that we need something to save us from our own appetites. It is for this reason that Aristotle holds that one can do moral philosophy only when one is old enough and one has been brought up to have good habits. Only then can one reflect aptly on what eudaimonia is and on what is really worth doing. A tragic drama then shows a protagonist with a hexis or character pursuing eudaimonia within a particular situation or problem setting. He comes to a bad outcome through a flaw or hamartia. It is important to emphasize here that the flaw is not a vice or blameworthy feature. It makes the most sense, I think, to think of it as a virtue, but a virtue that is exercised in a one-sided or obsessive way. Here, something that it is generally good to have, a virtue, for example, courage, or commitment to learning the truth, those are virtues. Something that one has that's a virtue leads the protagonist astray. This fits the case of Oedipus Rex, clearly the paradigm drama for Aristotle. Oedipus is led astray or defeated in his efforts to live well with others precisely by his resoluteness in seeking the murderer of Laius, the former king, in order to rid the city of a plague. That this happens, that his courage and his concern to know, that this happens leads to disaster. That this happens arouses both pity, eleos, sympathy or compassion, and fear, phobos or apprehensiveness in the audience, as they follow the unfolding events to their inevitable end. The audience is emotionally moved, and they grasp the significance of what is happening, how the beginning, Oedipus's decision and persistence in seeking the murder of Laius, that's where the play starts, leads to the middle, his questionings of others, to the climax of reversal and recognition, the herdsman establishing that it is Oedipus himself who is the murderer and the son of his now wife Jocasta, and the denouement or end, Oedipus accepting responsibility for what he has done, blinding himself and going into exile. According to Aristotle, participating as an audience member in this unfolding, watching this mimesis of events, has a point that is all at once emotional, evaluative, and cognitive. I will come back to this and claim that all important literature has this kind of point. It involves emotional, evaluative, and cognitive response, all mixed up together, though in more general terms than those offered by Aristotle. A tragedy, he writes, and perhaps the most important sentence of the Poetic, is an imitation of an action that is serious and also as having magnitude complete in itself, in language with pleasurable accessories, each kind brought in separately in the parts of the work, in a dramatic, not a narrative form, with incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish its catharsis of such emotions. The obvious puzzle here is to understand what Aristotle means by catharsis as the telos or final cause of tragedy, one that is achieved, the final cause, in the audience when the plot or organization or formal cause is of the right kind. Two answers to this, what does Aristotle really mean by catharsis, have been prominent in the literature. One, associated with Leon Golden and Martha Nussbaum, among others, is that catharsis means clarification or clearing up. The Greek root kathar means pure, as in the English name Catherine, or the late medieval ascetic sect of the Cathars. The idea here is the audience comes to understand or get clear about things that are pitiable and fearful in human life in general, namely that bad things can happen to good people, or that obsessive exercises of a virtue can lead in some circumstances to bad outcomes. All right, this might not sound like much news on the face of it, we all know that, but I'll come back to that idea too. The second, more medical reading is that catharsis means purification or discharge. The audience is aroused to feel explicitly and markedly the pity and fear that they might in fact be disposed to feel with regard to life in general, and that pity and fear are emptied out of them, so that they are restored to a more calm and accepting attitude toward life. Roughly, I think we can have it both ways here. So both the coming to understand model and the purification or emptying out model makes sense to me. The audience does come to a fuller grasp or understanding, itself bound up with emotions toward what is happening and an evaluative stance on what is happening. And coming to this full understanding involves the restoration of a balance of powers in the audience and in life in general, a power of willing and acting balanced against a power of waiting and accepting. The one-sided power of acting that Oedipus represents is a genuine power, but it cannot wholly control the course of events in nature. This seems to me to be what the chorus is saying in the last lines of the play, that you need in life to learn to wait and accept as well. Here's what the chorus says. Look, ye countrymen and Thebans, this is Oedipus the Great, he who knew the Sphinx's riddle and was mightiest in our state, who of all our townsmen gazed not on his fame with envious eyes. So right, we think he's praiseworthy. We wanted to be like him. Now in what a sea of trouble sunk and overwhelmed he lies. Therefore wait to see life's ending ere there count one mortal blessed. Wait till free from pain and sorrow he has gained his final rest. So there's an attitude of not trying to control everything that one must have in life, an attitude of waiting and acceptance. We, paradoxically, are both to act and to wait, and there is no ready recipe for how to do this. Nonetheless, there is a kind of sense or even divine nous in a world in which we can do this, both act and wait, and are to do this, a world of things, including us, that is formed by nous, but is not perfect. It's also subject to blots, interruption, or copy errors, here in the form of etuke, or ill fortune. Okay, we'll do a little bit more and then we'll take a break, I think. Yes, that's what I want to do. I will defend something like Aristotle's account of the function or purpose of important literature, the catharsis of pity and fear. I think there's an enormous amount to learn here from Aristotle, but not exactly in Aristotle's own terms. So what's wrong with Aristotle's theory? I have two related worries. The first, perhaps less important one, is that we cannot any longer take Aristotle's metaphysics seriously. The idea that divine nous is bestowing forms on things in order to reflect on and enjoy its own rational creative activity makes little sense in light of the achievements of modern physics. Though I have a student in Tennessee, interestingly a student from mainland China right now, who thinks Aristotle is absolutely right about all of this in his metaphysics, that physics is okay, but it's not ultimately as deep and explanatory a story about how things in the world are as Aristotle's story is. I don't know, I can't follow him there. I find the metaphysics speculative at best. But that's up to you to sort out how you feel about that too. Aristotle says about his account of nous as the first cause or prime mover, where the objects of its thought, namely created things, are both intelligible and good. This is from the book Lambda of the Metaphysics. He says, this is a possible account of the matter. And two, if it were not true, the world would have proceeded out of night and all things together and out of non-being. But is this the only possible account of where things in general come from? What if there is just no such account at all of where things come from? And what if the world just is chaos and night and all things together? These are possibilities Aristotle does not consider here. So if Aristotle's account of divine nous is implausible, can we any longer believe that we are created with our rational nature to have eudaimonia as our non-optional end or telos? One reply to this worry is that we don't need Aristotle's metaphysics in order to support his ethical theory. It is just more or less obvious that human beings do and should care about eudaimonia, or activity in accordance with virtue, perhaps with a slightly broader conception of virtuous activity, more than civic friendship plus philosophy, than Aristotle himself offered. This is more or less, I take it, Martha Nussbaum's view about how we're to learn from Aristotle, and it's a serious response to the criticism of Aristotle's metaphysics I just made. But this brings me to my second, more serious worry. Aristotle's paradigms of eudaimonia, like Plato's, are too narrow and too bound to the way of life of an Athenian aristocrat, perhaps one with theoretical inclinations, who did not have to support himself by working in the production sector of a modern economy, since Athens was a slave society. Here Aristotle says pointedly that the goodness of character necessary in the protagonist of a tragic drama, and necessary for having eudaimonia available to one, he says that goodness of character is possible in every type of personage, even in a woman or a slave, though the one is perhaps inferior and the other a wholly worthless being. This phrasing grates against at least my modern liberal democratic sensibilities. And while I find both friendships of virtue and the pleasures of theoretical understanding very important in life, I also find productive lives led by workers of all kinds to be important and valuable, especially if more meaningful work were available to all in a better organized economy. As Paul put it in Romans book 2, 11 to 12, "For there is no respect of persons with God. For as many as have sinned without law shall also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law." One thing this means is that a valuable and important life is not the unique possession of either the Jews or of Greek male aristocrats. There will be many, many divergent and potentially mutually opaque varieties of it. One important value for us, but not for Aristotle, is self-authorship, or articulating and acting according to one's own conception of the good, worked up out of available options and revisions of them, constrained by overall commitments to fairness, democratic equality, and respect for persons. I see no way of accommodating this sense of life in Aristotle. Aristotle was no Democrat in his political theory. I think that's a good place to stop. So that's all the Plato and Aristotle part one of the three parts I described of what we're going to do. We take a short break and then maybe have questions about this bit before we go further. Let's do that. Yes?
Questions now on the break.
Yeah, I was suggesting break first to give people a time to think about questions. But
Break? Okay.
yes? Good.
Vamos fazer uma pausa e aí na volta as pessoas podem fazer perguntas nessa primeira parte, tá bom? Alô, alô. Então, retomando para a segunda parte, se alguém quiser colocar alguma pergunta, seja em português, seja em inglês, a gente traduz, fiquem à vontade, tá bom? Ou a qualquer hora, viu? A qualquer momento, a ideia é essa, tá? Por favor.
Bom dia. Eu queria saber se tem alguma similaridade entre o uso divino que ele falou e a concepção de cristianismo de de concepção, de criação de mundo, de criação de objetos que ele comentou, se tem alguma uma semelhança, se realmente é algo da entender. Doutor, é só.
A gente faz as duas, acho que a gente faz a dela primeiro.
Acho que
Ele também tem uma pergunta.
a dela primeiro, né?
Acho que a dela tá. Just asking, is there any similarities between the nous divine, the divine nous, and the Christian notion of creation, the creation framing of the world? Like, how are they similar or not in this conception?
I get an easy question to start with. I am not a close reader of Genesis, so without looking at the creation story there, I think that the standard story is that what Aquinas did was simply adapt Aristotle's story about divine nous to Christianity, and thereby establish the basic theology of Christianity. It's an interesting question to think about what Christianity might look like if it were mostly the stories and the practice without the theology. So whether we need systematic theology in order for the Christian life is, for me, already itself an interesting question. I have some sympathies with Christian values and commitments, and relatively little sympathy with Christian theology. But the simple answer to the question is yes, Aristotle is, as Aquinas is Aristotle's picture of divine nous adapted to Christianity, and I think it's the more or less standard picture in Catholic theory. Does that sound right to you? Yeah?
Pessoal, I'll just quickly translate, summarize. Pessoal, eu tomei algumas notas, né? Eu não sei, todo mundo conseguiu entender? Alguém precisa da... Sim? Tá ok? Então tá bom. Tá. Everyone understands, so thank you.
Good. One thing I might add is I would be interested to hear from you whether you think any picture of Christian virtues is still important culturally, and whether we can hold on to that picture without the Aristotelian Thomist theology. These are questions I think about a lot, and I don't know the answer to that.
She's saying she doesn't have the answer to it. So Henrique is asking a question about parallels between theory of knowledge in Plato and Aristotle. And the question is it possible, how can we identify what is Platonic in the speculation on the concept of poiesis in Aristotle? Yes? Yeah? Okay.
I'm not myself a proper scholar of ancient philosophy. I don't publish on the correct interpretation of Plato and Aristotle, so my views may not be reliable on this topic. There are just enormous similarities and differences both in ethics and epistemology, both between Plato and Aristotle. Some people think of them as extraordinarily like each other, and they're correct, and some people think of them as completely different from each other, and it seems to me they're also correct. How can we understand this odd thing? I think the ethical value of the theoretical life in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics is a very, very Platonic idea, and I think it is central to Aristotle's thinking. I think Aristotle's picture of how to arrive at that kind of life and how to defend the value of that kind of life is perhaps more gradualist than Plato's. In the Republic, you will remember the cave where someone has to violently break free from ordinary life. Plato talks about the need to turn around the soul. That kind of language of violently breaking free or turning around is not as present in Aristotle. For Aristotle, we all have a rational capacity that's capable of guiding our lives, given more or less normal nurturance. Avoiding women and slaves, by the way, and here Plato is much more egalitarian about women than Aristotle is. But the point I'm trying to make is where Plato's images of the rule of reason in life tend to involve violent change of orientation. I think Aristotle's images are more images of biological growth and nurturance of the authority and reason. I think the endpoints that they arrive at are pretty similar, but I think the differences are in how readily we can get to the endpoint from within life and by paying attention to life. So Aristotle is obviously much more interested in observing the activity of nous in nature than Plato. He's more empirically oriented than Plato is for that reason. That goes together with this more gradualist epistemology. We work our way up to the rational life by making sense of things in nature in general, beginning with very careful observation. I think that's what I have to say about this. So the endpoint, the theoretical life, the importance of the authority of reason, very similar in Plato and Aristotle. The sense of the character of the path to getting to that life is somewhat different. There, Aristotle is more empirical, more worldly, more gradualist than Plato is.
Ok? Será o caso de traduzir? Acho que não, né? Tá certinho, né? Ok, tá. Ok, that's it. Ah, claro, claro.
Estou aqui para isso. Então, só resumindo também, eu tomei notas da primeira resposta, né, caso para que todo mundo possa seguir, né. A primeira pergunta, né, que a Rosa tinha feito, né, das similaridades, né, do nous divino, né, e da ideia da noção cristã da criação, né, da moldura, né, da criação cristã, que o Richard ele fala sobre da pergunta, né, como seria o cristianismo sem a teologia, né, e ele fala que ele segue nutrindo simpatia por alguns valores cristãos, né, no caso colocados por essa mirada da teologia, né. Então, como que esse conversa que também é uma conversa aristotélica, né? Acho que é mais ou menos isso, né? Se alguém lembra de mais algum... São todas as minhas notas aqui, tá? A outra pergunta, então, do colega, né, que ele respondeu agora, né, que ele vai falar de que há, sim, pontos de convergência, né, entre Platão e Aristóteles, e que ele cita especialmente o livro 10 da Poética, né, que ele fala dos valores éticos de Aristóteles, que são muito platônicos, né, ali neste livro 10. Né. É na Poética mesmo, né?
É na ética nicomaqueia.
É em qual, desculpa?
Na ética.
Ah, na ética, tá. Isso, desculpa. Eu achei estranho, mas é na ética. E como Aristóteles ele é mais gradual, né? Ele vai... não tem essa ideia de breaking free, assim, de uma quebra, né? E que como o trato do Aristóteles ele é mais empírico e mais mundano, né? Mais ligado com o mundo do que o Platão propunha, né? Ele chega a falar também, né, da questão do tratamento do Aristóteles, né, com mulheres e escravos, né, que o Platão seria já muito mais, né, teria uma visão muito mais igualitária sobre as mulheres do que o Aristóteles tinha, né? Então ele fala dessas, enfim, itens que aproximam e itens que separam. Né? Esqueci alguma coisa?
O aspecto gradualista também da...
Gradualista, né, da coisa de não quebrar, né, de não haver esse rompimento tão grande, né, ele é muito mais gradual, né, gradual. É isso?
Uhum.
Tô aqui, gente.
Yes, I understand.
Okay. Should we move on?
Yes, let me remind you of the overall structure and where we are in it. So we finished part A. That was the Plato and Aristotle part. Plato raises criticisms of literature and art in general that I think are still very important, partly because Descartes echoes those criticisms, and we find it very hard not to take a Cartesian conception of nature and of knowledge seriously. So Plato's criticisms are important. Literature lies, doesn't tell the truth, and it makes people care about the wrong things, maybe makes them have too many emotions that it's bad to have. Aristotle provides important replies to those criticisms, especially in the notion of catharsis as both clarification and purification. But some of Aristotle's replies rest on a metaphysics I can't accept, and Aristotle's ethical ideal is not sufficiently democratic or even Christian for me. So my agenda will be to accept modern metaphysics of physical nature, at least, and modern democratic values, but to try to make a case for the importance of literature in a modern scientific and democratic world. That's where I want to go here. The next step, part B, is to talk about what many other people have said about literature in the modern world as a source roughly of entertainment or pleasure. So most of these views, I think, are at best partially true and at worst mistaken. I think literature is enjoyable, but I'm going to argue in the third part that it's more than simply enjoyable. It is something we can and should learn from and deserves an important place in the university and in education in general. That it's even important for democratic culture, which is likely to be too much competitively egoistic, or a heap of people who don't know how to understand and appreciate each other. And I'm going to claim that literature will help us to do that, to make us a more conversational and less competitive democratic culture. That's the big picture here. So what we're going to get right now is the middle part, what other people have said about literature in modern times. Good. So this is contemporary philosophy of literature. Right.
Just to kind of summarize.
Oh, okay, please, yes.
Yeah, sorry. Oi. Alto. Tá, tá ouvindo? Não, gente, só para resumir, né, que ele estava colocando para nós para se situar onde a gente está no caminho que ele está propondo que a gente percorra, né? Então a gente terminou a primeira parte do mini-curso e agora a gente vai entrar na segunda parte, né? Então a gente, para fazer essas 3 etapas, né? Então basicamente no começo ele falou um pouco, resumindo, né, as conversas que a gente já teve, que estavam nas notas, né? E agora então para a gente entrar já também para essa transição para abordagens modernas, de escritores modernos, saindo das referências de Platão e Aristóteles para outros autores, né? Então ele vai citar outros autores também de literatura já, tá? Então, lembrando que são 3 etapas, né? Então agora a gente vai chegar na segunda, ok? Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. Good. So I'm at the top of page 10 in the text now.
Is it 6?
Number 6,
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
Yes, good.
Good.
So the 2 theorists I'll most talk about here are Monroe Beardsley. He was a philosopher of art, American philosopher of art, died sometime in the early 2000s. He was actually my predecessor at the college where I taught, so I was very honored to hold the same chair that he once held, the same distinguished chair. And a contemporary philosopher named Peter Lamarck, who's still working. He's just retired from the University of York very recently, but still professionally active. He wrote a very good summary book on contemporary philosophy of literature with the wonderful title, Philosophy of Literature. So if you want to see what's going on in contemporary writing by mostly analytic philosophers on literature, Peter Lamarck's book, Philosophy of Literature, is a very good place to start. Do you want to translate that bit? Or, yeah.
Ele estava falando sobre os 2 autores que ele vai usar agora de referência, que são Beardsley e Lamarck, né? Ele fala que Beardsley era um filósofo da arte, né, estadunidense, que ele ocupava a mesma cadeira que foi ocupada pelo Richard na universidade onde ele trabalhou, né? Então ele ocupou o lugar de Beardsley, que seria uma honra muito grande para ele, né? E o Peter Lamarck, que é o outro autor que ele está usando de referência, que ele fala que para quem quiser entrar na filosofia da literatura, tem esse livro que se chama Filosofia da Literatura, Philosophy of Literature, que é o livro do Lamarck, que ele está usando de referência e ele recomenda, que é um bom ponto de entrada. Então são os 2 autores que ele está usando.
Good. So, suppose I'm right, as I suggested in criticizing Aristotle, that eudaimonia is not a mandatory, non-optional end, or at least that it's not a mandatory end, the pursuit of which is built into us by divine nous, because I'm rejecting that divine nous story. And suppose further that it's not true that most people either do or should pursue eudaimonia, at least as Aristotle conceives of it. Activity in accordance with virtue, yes, but not just doing philosophy, and not just being free of the life of work and production, and not in a way that excludes women and people in general. Suppose that people are instead also committed to self-authorship, subject to constraints of fairness, to democratic equality, and to mutual respect. If that's right, then literature can't be devoted to the catharsis of pity and fear directed at the fragility of achievements of eudaimonia. There are other things people care about and should care about than eudaimonia as Aristotle conceived of it. So if that's right, what job is literature doing? The indication is that there are interesting overlaps, and the boundary is very permeable. And there are some works that fulfill both functions. Some contemporary, vernacularly influenced classical music. I have in mind, one example is the Kronos Quartet's recording of Jimi Hendrix's Purple Haze. I don't know if you know that. There are lots of crossovers and odd exceptions. And I think literary practice is interestingly aware of that. In literature, some detective novels seem to me to be works of genuine literary art. I'm thinking of Raymond Chandler and Elmore Leonard, for example. And some things that pretend to be literary art don't really deserve our attention, and we don't learn much from them. So there are lots of overlaps, exceptions, and interesting cases. And I think that our expectations are built on our awareness of that. So we have multiple different reasons for reading, and sometimes we're surprised. Sometimes we get a different set of expectations called into view by the work. Translate that, or? Yes.
I think I can almost write as fast. I could keep up this one. I was ready for translation. Gente, assim, a primeira reação foi que ele achou a pergunta muito boa, né, on target, né, ou seja, tipo, a pergunta está no ponto da discussão. Ele começa falando da ideia de beach reading, né, que seria essa ideia de que é muito comum nos Estados Unidos de se terem livros que são lidos na praia, né, uma espécie de livros de verão, assim, né, que são que a gente chama de escapismo, chega a falar em escapar da realidade, né. Então que ele começa falando dessa ideia do beach reading e aí ele parte para a música e que na música tem esse overlap, ou seja, que tem pontos de contato que não necessariamente vão ser uma música, vão ter músicas que podem ser músicas de concerto que vão dar conta de temas da música vernacular e vice-versa, né? Que há uma zona de contato que talvez na música seja muito mais borrada do que na literatura, pelo que ele está falando, né? E aí mesmo assim ele volta então a dar exemplo de romances de detetive que nos propõem experiências de aprendizado, né? E aí ele fala, tem livros, tem romances que se colocam como romances de arte, vamos dizer assim, e que também não nos dão uma experiência de aprendizado. E aí no fim ele fala muito de como isso depende das nossas expectativas, né? Então como a gente coloca a expectativa também vai definir no tipo de relação que a gente vai ter com a obra.
Ele deu dois exemplos, um musical e um literário. O literário foi Raymond Chandler, que é um autor de história de detetive, né? E outro exemplo do Kronos Quartet, que gravou Purple Haze do Jimi Hendrix, como exemplos dessa imbricação, né?
Quer fazer alguma colocação? Não? Ok. Thanks.
Good. So I think that the points that Lamarck and Olson make are good ones. So again, their central argument was that works of literature provide no evidence or argument in the way that science and logic do. No experiments, no data, no deductive reasoning. That's generally correct about literature. They provide no evidence or argument for the truth of any propositions or explicit claims. What is a proposition or an explicit claim? It's the content of a declarative sentence, the kind of content that might be expressed in a single sentence that has a truth value or can be evaluated as true or false. The bottle is on the table. That sentence has a propositional content, namely the condition that it's true just in case the bottle is on the table, as it is right now. So that's what I mean by propositional content.
Acho que vale a pena esclarecer essa ideia de conteúdo proposicional, ou seja, você pode afirmar diversas coisas de diversas formas sobre o mundo, mas há um tipo de afirmação que em filosofia normalmente se chama de proposição, que tem um caráter especial. Por que tem um caráter especial? Porque justamente por causa da sua forma, ou seja, logicamente, ela acolhe o que a gente chama de bivalência, ela pode ser verdadeira ou falsa. E por que isso acontece? Porque ela se relaciona de maneira figurativa com o que a gente chama de um estado de coisas. Ele exemplificou com o fato da garrafa estar em cima da mesa, né? Então, há uma garrafa em cima da mesa em que o Richard está debruçado, é verdadeira e agora é falsa, né? A proposição é verdadeira e agora é falsa, e agora é verdadeira de novo. E o fato dessa tipo de afirmação, que é a proposição, se relacionar assim com o estado de coisas, é que faz com que filósofos chamem essas afirmações de proposições. E isso é importante para o que ele quer, para a noção de que há um tipo de conhecimento na literatura, enfim, que tipo de conhecimento é esse, né, que há na literatura também, além das ciências.
Yeah, it's good. So I think they're correct. Works of literature provide no evidence or argument like the kind of evidence and argument you get in science and logic for the truth of any propositions. And second, if you gave a propositional formulation of what you might learn from reading a literary text, that formulation is likely to be very trivial and not much news. I believe those points are correct. The underlying assumption, though, is that propositional truth is the only kind of truth, and that science and logic are the only ways of learning. So is that right? Is propositional truth the kind of truth you get in a single sentence, evaluatable as true or false? Is that the only kind of truth? Are propositions the only vehicles or bearers of truth or falsity, the only kinds of things that can be true or false? Isn't there such a thing as a true or truthful or more adequate view of life? So I'm going to talk about a perspective or a view of life as the kind of thing that can be true or false, or more or less adequate, or richer or thinner, something like that. Elsewhere, Lamarck and Olson express some openness to the idea that literature might afford a different form of insight that lends itself to appraisal in terms other than those of knowledge and truth. I'm pretty much going to go with that idea, having truthfulness to life, or adequacy or richness of a view of life as the kind of cognitive value we get from literature. Second, might the reception of literary works normally improve character when it takes place in a context of free and open critical discussion? Lamarck and Olson concede that we might profit ethically from a generalizing commentary that elicits the exemplary moral value of some literary works. But they suggest that in this case, the work, the ethical work, is done largely by the generalizing commentary, and that any conclusions that generalizing commentary suggests are themselves in need of support from either evidence or direct argumentation. I think literature that functions as art is made to be talked about, that's part of its normal reception. So I'm going to suggest that there's something wrong with a focus only on, or primarily on, enjoyment and appreciation, and not enough focus on cognitive value in the experience of literature, according to Lamarck and Olson. Lamarck and Olson have many accurate and important things to say about the kinds of things readers do and expect to do in appreciating literary works. Lamarck is surely right that readers expect to pay attention to, and do pay attention to, the literary structures, the diction and figuration, the subjects, plots or stories, and themes of works of literary art. And they are right that we find doing so rewarding in itself and enjoyable, or at least often. But is that a sufficient account of what we do and expect to do when we read serious works of literary art? Don't we do other things and expect other things? At first blush, initially, it seems to me not to capture some of the urgencies to tell hitherto unheard truths that motivate writers to do what they do. That is, I think literary writers, many of them often, have something they very badly want to say, to open the eyes of people to the way the world is in some sense. And some of the urgencies to come to these kind of truths that lead readers to literary works and to urge them on each other. So I think readers sometimes, not always, expect to be offered a new view of the world that will shape their own perspective on life and the world. All right, here is where the argument breaks down, and I rely on examples. And whether these examples will work for you, I don't know. Let's consider, I have two here, but I think we'll just do one. Two short poems that seem to express such urgencies related to truth-telling. So this is the, yes, there it is on the board. It's in Portuguese too? Good. A very famous poem by Rainer Maria Rilke, Archaic Torso of Apollo. Good, good, good. So I guess I will read it through in English. Do you want to read it through in Portuguese after I do? Sure. Yes, good. We cannot know his legendary head with eyes like ripening fruit, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. Otherwise the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to that dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise this stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders, and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur, would not, from all the borders of itself, burst like a star. For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life.
Eu vou ler a tradução do Manuel Bandeira, O Torso Arcaico de Apolo. Não sabemos como era a cabeça que falta de pupilas amadurecidas. Porém, o torso arde ainda como um candelabro e tem, só que meio apagada, a luz do olhar que salta e brilha. Se não fosse assim, a curva rara do peito não deslumbraria, nem achar caminho poderia um sorriso e baixar da anca suave ao centro onde o sexo se alteara. Não fosse assim, seria essa estátua uma mera pedra, um desfigurado mármore, e nem já resplandecera mais como pele de fera. Seus limites não transporia, desmedida como uma estrela, pois ali ponto não há que não te mire, força é mudar de vida.
Here I have not written out everything in the text, so you might want to stop me and translate some portions at some point. There is a a full analysis of this poem in a chapter on it in my book, Literature, Life, and Modernity. So there is a place to see more stuff on this poem written out. There are two formal things I want to point to, two pieces of structure. The first is that it is what's called a broken sonnet. So it is a 14-line poem, a sonnet, with the correct rhyme scheme, Petrarchan as it happens, with what's called a volta, or a turn. The volta in a Shakespearean or Petrarchan sonnet is where the poem breaks off from telling a story and offers a moral or a theme or conclusion or commentary on what has happened. So that's called the volta, or turn. Translate.
Gente, às vezes fica muito alto, né? Estou tentando falar pouco mais longe. Tem há capítulo, uma análise completa no livro. What is the name of your book again? Sorry.
Literature, Life, and Modernity.
Literatura, Vida e Modernidade, né? Que é capítulo que ele se debruça sobre esse poema, né? Uma análise bem mais pormenorizada desse poema, né? Que ele está falando de questões formais do poema, né? Ele fala da tradição dos sonetos. Alguém aqui foi aluno de poesia? A gente falou bastante disso. It's just that we talk a lot about the volta and the sonnets in our poetry classes. Some of my
Good.
students are familiar with that. Mas a gente dos sonetos shakespearianos de Petrarca, né, que tem essa questão da volta, né, ou turn, né, que é a volta, que é o nome em português já diz, né, que é quando há uma quebra no que está sendo trazido no soneto para, né, uma espécie de quebra de expectativa que pode vir de alguma maneira moral ou de alguma mudança, uma reversão do que está sendo colocado no poema até então, né? Então ele fala bastante disso nesse poema.
Good. So this is a broken sonnet because the volta comes in the middle of the last line instead of at the head of the last two lines. Here the volta occurs with "you must change your life." That's a line that, at least on first reading, I think strikes you with enormous force and surprise, almost as coming out of nowhere.
Então ele fala que é broken sonnet, né? Ou seja, soneto que é quebrado, porque normalmente a volta ela vai aparecer no começo, né, da última seção do soneto, né? E aqui não, aqui que é a última, né? Está traduzido aqui como força mudares de vida, né? You must change your life.
You must change your life.
Então, que é uma frase de impacto que funciona como volta, mas que é uma volta tardia, né? Por isso que seria um modelo quebrado do soneto tradicional, os modelos de Shakespeare e Petrarca.
So the question we have to ask is, where does that thought come from? What motivates this volta, and does it work?
Então a pergunta é, o que motiva essa volta? E de onde ela está vindo? Né? O que motiva essa volta?
Okay, now I think it's important that the poem prior to that is describing the experience of a statue, an experience that the poet himself has had, though interestingly it's put in the first person plural, as though anyone could have this experience by looking at that statue. So the bulk of the poem is a description, a first person singular or plural description of that experience. It's important that the statue is missing its head, so it's a broken example of a classical piece. So it's like a broken sonnet. And what I'll be arguing is that the experience that the readers are to have of the poem itself is like the experience the poet is describing of the statue.
Ele fala muito deixa eu só voltar aqui, né? Sobre o uso da primeira pessoa do plural, desculpa, né? Com a ideia de aproximar a experiência da primeira pessoa do plural, com nós, né? Da experiência da estátua quebrada, né? Que ele está falando de uma estátua quebrada. Então a gente está se colocando, né? Também como parte dessa estrutura quebrada, né? E aí ele está propondo, então, que a gente estaria, como se qualquer pessoa pudesse ter a experiência dessa estátua quebrada, e que essa estátua quebrada, essa imagem, ela é importante como o soneto, que também está quebrado. Então há uma quebra de duas formas clássicas aqui, tanto na imagem trazida no poema da estátua, que está quebrada, quanto no próprio soneto, que está quebrado, que também é uma forma clássica de poesia, né? Então, aproximando essas duas quebras, né?
Good. So now we must ask, what is the experience that the poet has of the statue? Here the thing to do, I suggest, is to focus on the verbs that are used to characterize the statue. So suffused with brilliance from inside, gleams in all its power, dazzle, flared, glisten, burst like a star, and even translucent cascade. That's not a verb phrase, but it suggests something flowing out. We should pay attention to these verb phrases or verb-adjacent phrases as describing a kind of power that the torso has. Its insides are powerfully manifested in its outsides. It seems to gleam, speak, be alive. And I think the thought is that our lives are not like that. I failed to manifest my powers of creativity, my erotic energies, my sense of having a power to address life and participate in it. I've somehow failed to do that. The statue succeeded, so the statue is a kind of criticism of or rebuke to me. My life should be more like what this statue is like. My insides, my powers should be expressed or manifested in my life, as opposed to being a mere cipher of convention or of the expectations other people have of me. And I suggest it's this experience that the poem is giving us itself when we read it.
Ele propõe que a gente tenha, até tá um pouco aqui nesse trecho, né, de que a gente preste atenção nos verbos, né, que o poeta está usando, né, que são todos são verbos que trazem essas imagens de luz, né. E aí, no caso, então, como que nós, como leitores, a gente se enxerga com essa ideia de fracasso, né? Então, se eu falhei, como que essa estátua ela conseguiu ser bem sucedida, né? No seu poder, né? Na sua função erótica, e como que nós, como leitores, a gente vai enxergar nessa estátua mesmo quebrada, né? Esse sucesso, e ao mesmo tempo como o poema vai nos dar essa sugestão de que a estátua foi bem sucedida ao mesmo tempo em que ela está quebrada, né?
Vai haver uma fluidez de expressão e isso aparece na ênfase que ele sugere que a gente dê aos verbos do poema.
Good. So that's so much for the poem at the moment. This is only one example, but the suggestion I am making is that the kind of revision or adjustment in complexes of feeling, evaluation, and belief, I come to feel about my life in a new way, to evaluate it differently, and to have some different beliefs about it. An adjustment in complexes of feeling, evaluation, and belief about how things are going with us, with me, is one of the central functions of literary art, and that readers of literary works of art, at least sometimes, expect and are on the lookout for this kind of revision and adjustment. Wordsworth, in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, wrote that as a result of these poems, quote, "The understanding of the reader must necessarily be in some degree enlightened, and his affections strengthened and purified, against the pull of a degrading thirst after outrageous stimulations that is common in industrial, urban, modern culture." So Wordsworth, too, noted this kind of combination of change all at once in understanding, feeling, and evaluation, particularly understanding of, feeling about, and evaluation of how one's own life, how our life is going, what's up with us, is it healthy and meaningful or not? That's the kind of issue I think literature addresses. Translate any of that, or this is a place I think I want to stop. I have other examples, but maybe we ought to stop with this thought for a moment and talk about this.
Yeah. Can you just repeat just the last bit, because it was just like following. Sorry.
Yes. I think that readers expect sometimes this kind of revision and adjustment all at once of understanding, feeling, and evaluation directed at how our life is going, how we're doing. Are things going well or not? Are they healthy or not? But I've given only one example so far.
Certo. Então, que a ideia de que ele estava trazendo de Wordsworth na citação, né, e depois, então, que a ideia de que os leitores, quando entram em contato com a literatura, há essa espécie de uma revisão, né, de qual o tipo de expectativa que o leitor tem com a obra, né. Então, há esse ajuste, né, então, para tentar entender esse sentimento de avaliação mesmo, né. Então, se as coisas estão saudáveis, se as coisas estão indo bem, as coisas estão acontecendo de um jeito saudável ou não, né? Como leitor, há essa pergunta. Né?
E essa avaliação ela transcende o domínio do espaço literário, né? Essa avaliação também incide sobre a nossa vida. A ideia é essa, que haveria uma solução de continuidade entre o que se exprime na literatura e uma avaliação sobre a nossa própria vida. Não é?
This proposal of yours goes further or has any kind of relation with the identification in the Aristotelian sense, in his ethics and his aesthetics? Is it different? Is there a kind of identification with, Aristotelian aesthetics?
Yes, I think so. Imaginative participation or sharing in the point of view and on what's happening and the experience of what's happening is central here, as in, right, the protagonist for Aristotle must be someone who is like us, though perhaps better.
You cannot say the same. What's the difference?
Imaginatively trying on the point of view is the idea I'm after. My next example may get us to that, we'll see. But no, of course, I am not in the museum with Wilke. I'm imagining with Wilke what it was like to be in that museum and to have that experience, while at the same time I'm also aware that I'm reading a poem by Rilke and I'm paying attention to it directly, not to the statue, which I'm paying attention to only indirectly or imaginatively. So in some sense, I'm in Rilke's position. I'm imagining seeing the statue. And in some sense, I'm in Rilke's position even more intimately in imagining or actually having, as I read the poem, the thoughts that Rilke himself had. So there's a lot of imaginative participation in a point of view going on, in perhaps multiple points of view, both the point of view manifested or assumed in the direct experience, and more importantly, the point of view made available to us by the poem itself. So yes, I would call those objects of imaginative identification.
Eu, na verdade, não sei se a minha pergunta ajuda ou atrapalha, mas eu ouvi ecos de uma discussão da estética aristotélica de identificação, né? Então, perguntei a ele qual seria a diferença, que ele não está dizendo exatamente o que Aristóteles disse, então, que ele pedi que ele explorasse um pouco mais essa ideia, né? Eu não sei se isso esclareceu a pergunta. Espero que não tenha atrapalhado.
Acho que ele começa a resposta falando que segundo Aristóteles, né, o protagonista, né, do Aristóteles deveria ser como nós ou melhor que nós, né, na ideia dele. A ideia dele é Aristóteles, né? E que no caso do poema do Rilke, né, a gente se imagina estar no museu com o Rilke, mas nós não estamos no museu com o Rilke, né? E que há uma experiência de atenção indireta, né? Ou seja, a gente está com a posição da voz do poema do Rilke, né, em alguns pontos, e nós não estamos vendo a estátua diretamente, né? Então esse ponto de vista ele é disponibilizado pelo poema, né? Ou seja, a gente tem acesso à estátua pela voz do Rilke, né? Pela voz ainda que é construída pelo Rilke no poema, né? Então seria essa espécie de experiência mediada ou indireta, né? Uma leitura indireta, né?
Mas ao mesmo tempo compartilhada, né? Então é importante ressaltar que há o compartilhamento de um ponto de vista, e isso não deixa de ser uma porta aberta para esclarecer o que ele depois vai articular como sendo, digamos, o conteúdo de eventualmente um possível uso do conceito de verdade, né, na literatura.
É um pouco que vai seguir essa conversa na sequência do curso.
think perhaps where we are is that I should try to sum up this thought and not do the other example directly, and then we'll do some more examples next time, and I will expand on this thought further. The kind of view I'm developing here has come to be called by other people in the literature neo-cognitivism. Why neo-cognitivism? Two reasons. First, the experience of literature is not only about pleasure or enjoyment or appreciation, it's about pleasure or enjoyment or appreciation mixed with enhancement of understanding. Second, the kind of enhancement of understanding in question is not learning a new fact of a kind that might be expressed in a sentence, not a new propositional content. It's an enhancement of understanding that involves having an enriched, fuller, or more adequate perspective on the world. So here are some examples of people who defend a neo-cognitivist view of literature. The issue here is like the issue in the philosophy of the social sciences that contrast understanding or Verstehen with knowledge or Erkenntnis, or the Geisteswissenschaften that pursue understanding, getting a sense of what's up with people, with what their lives are like, from scientific laws or true propositions. Ingrid Vendrell-Ferran, a German theorist, writes, "The notion of understanding that we apply to the natural world cannot be applied directly to explain what it means to understand ourselves or the social world by means of literature." These are up on the, I'm on page 16 now. Right. Understanding is holistic, entails seeing and creating connections between bits of knowledge, and has a processual nature. You have to participate in a process. It involves giving significance to individual truths. It is non-factive, comes in degrees, and is largely non-propositional and can be achieved in many ways. Engaging with literary perspectives and becoming acquainted with certain experiences can be regarded as an activity which transforms the person we are, enables us to understand ourselves better, to evaluate our lives more fully and adequately, to come to emotional terms with our lives. Catherine Wilson, in a paper called Literature and Knowledge, urges a similar view. A person may learn from a novel if he is forced to revise or modify, for example, his concept of reasonable action, what it would make sense for someone in a situation to do, through a recognition of an alternative as presented in a novel. The term learning applies primarily to the modification of a person's concepts under which they understand what is going on and have emotions and evaluative stances about it, which in turn, that modification is in turn capable of altering his thought or conduct, and not primarily to an increased disposition to utter factually correct statements or to display technical prowess, right, to know more true sentences or to know how to make useful things. It's the idea of having a revised or enriched perspective as a result of undergoing a process of imaginative identification that's crucial here. That's the neo-cognitivist view that I share with Vendrell-Ferran and with Catherine Wilson.
Perhaps I can summarize this idea of... sim, perdão. Talvez eu possa dar uma súmula dessa ideia. Enfim, ele está apontando para uma série de filósofos da literatura recentes, bem recentes, que falam de um neocognitivismo, ou seja, uma ideia, uma certa ideia de como é que se pode defender que a literatura, de que nós possamos obter conhecimento com literatura. Em que sentido a gente fala de conhecimento? Certamente não um conhecimento proposicional, como a gente mencionou agora há pouco, certamente não um conhecimento relativo a produzir coisas ou desenvolver técnicas de produção disso ou daquilo, mas sim um conhecimento que diga respeito a um aumento do entendimento sobretudo acerca da nossa própria vida, não é? Tanto individual quanto coletiva, E também na direção da aquisição de uma perspectiva enriquecida ou revisada e mais clara sobre o mundo e a vida. Também essa ideia de uma partilha de perspectivas a poderem ser revisadas, ao serem esclarecidas, é importante para esse neocognitivismo.
So I think questions now. Discussion. Yes.
Yeah, então agora a gente, enfim, abre para perguntas e discussões sobre isso, né? Temos o horizonte aqui, no fim de contas, desde aquele percurso com os antigos, é entender justamente isso, né? Se e como é possível defender a ideia de que nós aprendemos com a literatura e que tipo de coisa nós aprendemos com a literatura, né? Uma maneira de perguntar isso é: em que sentido nós podemos aplicar o conceito de verdade? In what way can we apply the concept of truth in relation to literature?
What you're supposed to do is say, yes, yes, that's what I look for and sometimes get from literature. Thank you for making sense of this experience. But if you're not saying that, I want to hear why.
Ele falou que da literatura é tipo, sim, sim, obrigado por, né, fazer sentido, fazer as coisas terem sentido, né? Mas se não está dizendo isso, então por quê, né? Gente, alguém tem perguntas? Se ninguém tiver, vocês correm o risco de me perguntar de novo.
Fica à vontade. A pergunta não é trivial, não é fácil a gente entender, porque paga-se um preço muito grande ao se dizer que não é possível aplicar o conceito de verdade à literatura, né? E, ao mesmo tempo, se a gente não quer pagar esse preço, então, a ideia de conhecimento não científico como envolvendo essa noção de aprofundamento, né?
That is, again, exactly right. Wittgenstein is a very important resource for me in thinking about a kind of understanding, what he calls the kind embodied in an übersichtliche Darstellung, a perspicuous representation, having a kind of overview or surview of related cases of things that are going on in life. This idea actually comes from Goethe originally. It's where Wittgenstein got it. And that idea about literature as a source, that Goethean idea about literature as a source of views of life that I first came across by way of Wittgenstein, is very important to me. The second point is more controversial, but I'm right there with you too. I think philosophy is very like this. I think philosophy is quite like literature, essentially one of the humanities, a way of cultivating understanding or a better, more adequate grip on ourselves and how we're doing, and that its methods are fundamentally different from logic and science. I have things to say about why logic should still be taught in philosophy departments. It can be part of the enterprise. Philosophy has a kind of aspiration to absolute generality in getting it right for all time, how we're doing. I think it's important that philosophy lives with that aspiration. It defines the enterprise to know once and for all who we are and how we're doing. But I think it's an enterprise doomed to failure, and that philosophy, in the end, is a lot more like literature than it thinks of itself as being.
wouldn't you say that we can perhaps tame a little bit the absolute character of this reach towards a generality, and especially by getting rid of the idea of some of its results being once and for all, settled once and for all? So can we save a little bit of these envisioning towards generality if we get rid of the idea of it being once and for all and absolute?
I don't know. The very last line of Stanley Cavell's epical book, The Claim of Reason, is directed to this very problem. The last line is, can philosophy become literature and still know itself? Can it give up this drive towards absoluteness, toward once and for all, and still maintain any sense with what it's been in the past, any sense of its distinctness as an enterprise? I think Cavell thinks we have to give it up, as I do, that it can't be maintained, and yet that threatens to make it no longer philosophy. I think part of the drive to fullness of mastery, I think is there in the human character ultimately, even though it is very dangerous and can't be satisfied. I'm not sure what more to say than that.
Talvez eu possa resumir o ponto da seguinte maneira. Do que se trata aqui é de entender se... ou seja, em que sentido a gente pode falar de uma linha de continuidade entre filosofia e literatura, né? E se, uma vez a filosofia abandonando uma espécie de sonho da razão, como disse alguém um dia, de poder, de fato, almejar uma espécie de absoluta generalidade, e não só absoluta generalidade, mas uma generalidade cujos resultados possam se reconhecer como legítimos de uma vez por todas, né? Resultados absolutos também no sentido de finais. Se ao abandonar isso, a filosofia, ao se acomodar melhor nessa solução de continuidade com a literatura, ela não acabaria por perder aquilo que ela tem de característico, que é justamente essa busca por, digamos agora então, de maneira mais modesta, uma certa generalidade. E o Richard menciona que é um dos pontos com que o Cavell termina a sua obra maior, que é Reivindicações da Razão, The Claim of Reason. É isso?
Acho que tem essa questão de I don't know, just thinking like how can we, with this question of this once and for all, how can this question of how can we set philosophy and literature apart, like can we or should we, in the sense of how can we have this as you mentioned, this like sources of like views on life, and what kind of the representation, and what kind of discussion we can have about life that could be approximated or distanced in like philosophy and literature. That sounds, it's kind of a question or a comment or I don't know.
So I edited a collection called the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy and Literature. And in the introduction to that handbook, it's called Literature as a Form of Attention to Life. I described philosophy and literature as comparatively distinct but intimately related forms of attention. I have no interest in establishing philosophy's absolute purity and distinctness from literature. In this, I am different from some Wittgensteinians, such as Peter Hacker, who think, no, conceptual analysis, that's different from storytelling. No, I think there's a lot of imagination, storytelling, the mobilizing of imaginative identification and so forth that goes on in philosophy, and should go on in philosophy. So maybe no ultimate distinction. What are the relative distinctions? Comparative generality, a pretense, but only a pretense to neutrality. So I do think philosophy is often more situated and critically responsive to life, and less detached and neutral than philosophy is often taken to be. And maybe an obsession or domination by fear of death that's pretty important in literature too, I guess, after all. But I think philosophers typically are motivated, the best philosophers, by a wish to comport with the eternal and thereby to overcome death. These are only relative distinctions, not absolute ones, for me at least.
And it is difficult to imagine even traditional philosophy without literary devices, some literary devices.
Yes.
We talk about thought experiments, but they are really fictional scenes. Yeah?
Gente, só vou traduzir a resposta, né? Na verdade, eu tinha perguntado, mais ou menos comentando esse ponto que ele tinha falado sobre como a gente poderia separar a filosofia da literatura, né? Se podemos. E ele fala que ele editou, né, essa coleção, né, da filosofia da literatura, e que ele abre o livro, né, falando que a literatura é uma forma de atenção à vida, né? Uma frase que eu uso. E que elas são, né, a filosofia e a literatura, elas são distintas, mas intimamente conectadas, né? E ele fala que a filosofia também vai lidar com a imaginação, fabulação, contação de histórias, né? E que não há uma distinção definitiva, mas que há, assim, distinções relativas, né? E que a filosofia ela ainda vai nutrir essa pretense, né? Essa espécie de pretensão falsa, vamos dizer assim, ou enfim, não é falsa a palavra, mas uma pretensão, vamos dizer assim, inatingível, vamos dizer assim, de neutralidade, né?
Ilusória.
Ilusória, a palavra que eu queria, né? E a obsessão que a filosofia vai trazer no seu fazer, né? Essa obsessão com o medo da morte, o superar a morte, né? Mas que ele reconhece que a literatura também tem isso. It was a joke my students had, like, Laura, why are you so obsessed with death? Like, all of the poems we read are about death, and I hadn't realized that until one of my students told me that. Eu estava falando dos meus alunos de poesia, dizendo, Laura, por que tu é obcecado com a morte? Porque eu só trazia poemas de morte para as minhas aulas de poesia. Gente, do we have other questions?
Definitely, and answer questions. Can I go out and use the restroom? The coffee has coffee with me, so
A gente vai ter que encerrar, o Richard precisa... só talvez, para a gente encerrar, enfatizar essa noção de formas de atenção. Essa última intervenção dele, eu acho que se centra essencialmente nessa noção de literatura e filosofia como formas de atenção. Formas de atenção a quê? A vida no sentido de vida humana, a experiência conceptualizada, né? Bom, ele teve que sair, infelizmente, então a gente encerra aqui essa primeira parte do mini-curso sobre filosofia da literatura. A gente volta na quarta-feira e amanhã ele tem uma palestra, ele vai dar uma palestra lá em São Lázaro, na Faculdade de Filosofia, sobre Stanley Cavell e a conquista das individualidades, né? Na semana que vem a gente tem também um mini-curso sobre filosofia do cinema, mesmos dias e horários, e na terça-feira à tarde, no Museu de Arte da Bahia, às 16h, ele vai dar uma palestra sobre justamente as relações entre verdade e poesia. Tá bom? Sim, e nas quintas-feiras, essa quinta e na outra quinta, vai haver debates sobre filmes. Então ele está muito interessado em filosofia do cinema. Os detalhes são ali naquele cartaz, né? E o cartaz também contém o site, e no site está bem explicado os horários, locais e todas essas atividades, tá bom? Então eu convido todo mundo, vejam lá no site e partilhem para as pessoas poderem participar também. Bom, obrigado, gente.